Chapter 1. Continued. Truly it had not been the work or the stifling summer inside the fort, or even the constant fear of Indians that had weighed on Miriam's spirit. It had been the loneliness. Of course she loved Susanna, just 10 years older than she, who had been both mother and sister, and she adored the children. But she longed for friends, for just one friend of her own. She had never known a girl her own age. She had never had a beau. Of the few young men and boys at the fort, now that she was too old for racing and climbing trees with them, she felt both shy and critical. She had had so little experience, she could not have put into words just what sort of person she waited for. Yet from the first moment that Phineas had walked into the enclosure with the men, something within her had unmistakably recognized him. He was different from the men she had known. He was strong and practical as any of them, as he proved by setting to work straight away, felling trees and dragging logs to repair the blockhouse. Inside of a half day, the settlement had accepted him as though he had been born at number 4. But there was a gentleness in his speech, and a purpose in his serious young face that set him slightly apart. It was incredible, even though he had said it in his own words, that he had noticed her in the brown homespun, even before he had seen her in the blue dress. In her own mind, the bolt of blue cloth that James had brought in his pack had changed her into a different person. The dress that hung close to her head, waiting for the first rays of sun to light it into beauty, symbolized the wonder of the past few days. I'll have to put on the old brown dress in the morning, probably even for supper, she thought ruefully. But I can wear the blue to meeting on Sunday, and perhaps, if I do all the work, Susanna will have another party before Phineas goes. Oh, how can I lie still all the hours till sunup? I can never sleep a wink. But she was sound asleep when the cabin shook with the tremendous knocking at the door. Chapter 2. The knocking startled Miriam wide awake. Pulling herself up to her knees, she knelt and peered down the loft hole. In the pale light she could see her brother-in-law, James, struggling into his jacket as he lurched, still half asleep, across the cabin floor. "Confound you, Labbery," he muttered. "Do you have to be as early as all this?" He drew back the bolt and swung open the door. Neighbor Labbery's solid figure filled the doorway, and his hearty voice boomed through the cabin. "Still abed, all of you? Thought you ain't to start on the south field before daybreak." Without warning, it happened. James Johnson's answer was drowned in such dreadful shrieks that Miriam's whole body turned to stone. She had heard them before, but far away, in the depths of the forest. Now they were close, close upon them. Indians. Labbery was jerked backward, and the doorway was filled with bodies, pouring into the cabin with horrible yells. The half-light was a confusion of feathers, hideous faces streaked with red and white, tomahawks flashing. James leaped towards his musket, but 3 Indians were upon him in a flash, binding his arms tight against his body. Other redskins swarmed about the cabin, tearing open cupboards and chests, pawing over food and clothes, stuffing sacks with everything they could lay hands on. One slid open a feather bed, shaking out a choking cloud of feathers, and used the ticking as a bag to hold his plunder. 2 of the savages came from the bedroom, dragging a shrinking and almost naked Susanna between them. Terror suddenly stabbed Miriam's paralyzed mind and body into action. In a moment they would discover the loft stairs. The girl's wits came back to her. Behind her was a window, hardly more than a slit in the wall, but big enough, if she had to crawl through and escape. It was not too much of a drop to the ground. If she could get out, make a run for the fort, they might not notice. She could run as fast as any Indian. Once out of the cabin, her chances were good, even in the woods. If she could reach the fort, she could rouse the men and get help. On hands and knees, she crawled to the window and knocked out the shutter. In the din downstairs, the clatter could not be heard. One bare leg was out and over the sill when her eyes caught a sight that stopped and held her. The children. They were wide awake, sitting up in their beds and watching her, without a sound, just looking, their eyes round and glassy like the eyes of little animals in the traps. Even at that moment, Sylvanus struggled out of his covers and came scrambling towards her, whimpering like a frightened puppy. A wave of anger swept over Miriam. "No!" she scolded. "No, Vanus, go back!" But his small hands reached her and clung. Of a sudden she hated him, hated all 3 of them with their white faces. But for them she would be halfway to the fort by now. She dragged her leg back over the sill. She could not leave them. "I'll let you down, Vanus," she whispered. "You run for the fort. Run as hard as you can. Sue, quick! Move, Sue! You go right after him." It was too late. An iron arm hooked round her waist and jerked her back. A brown hand reached round her and dragged Sylvanus away from the window. When she tried to struggle, a cruel twist of her wrist sent a stab of agony up to her shoulder. Half off her feet, she stumbled and fell after her captor, down the ladder across the cabin floor, into the clearing outside. The others were all there, even Peter Labourie, bound fast like James. The 3 children threw themselves sobbing against their mother, and Susanna, her arms held by her 2 captors, tried to comfort them with her voice. "Hush, chickens," she faltered. "You're all to rights. Don't cry." The Indians were arguing with each other in rough tones and menacing gestures. A few were bent on killing the prisoners at once, and their threatening tomahawks turned Miriam cold. Then one warrior, apparently the leader, stepped forward and silenced the jabbering with one curt syllable. His eyes swept over the prisoners, scowling disdainfully at the women in their night shifts. He gestured to one of his men and barked a command. The Indian glowered, but he opened a sack, stuffed to bursting with goods from the cabin, grudgingly pulled out 3 dresses, and threw them on the ground in front of Susanna. A ruffled length of petticoat trailed from the sack. "That too," Susanna pleaded, pointing. But if the Indian understood, he intended to part with nothing else. Susanna's arms were freed for a moment, and she picked up one of the dresses and drew it clumsily over her head. Miriam was tossed another, a grey homespun, worn and patched. Little Susanna, bundled into the 3rd, was helpless to move, and when the Indian who had parted with it saw that the blouse of her mother's dress reached almost to the child's knees, he slashed at the cloth with his knife, ignoring her screech of terror, yanked the skirt away and stuffed it back into his sack. Sylvanus was allowed a little jacket of his own. In this flimsy clothing they seemed to satisfy the Indians. With a horrid yell the captors pushed, prodded, and dragged their prisoners into the woods. Sharp cramps began to shoot up and down Miriam's arm, as the iron fingers of her captor never lost their grip. They had turned away from the clearing, straight into the thicket where the thorns tore at her leg and stabbed her bare feet. The Indians were in a hurry now, sensing that the fort must have been aroused by the racket, and they forced their prisoners on impatiently. Poor Susanna, heavy with her unborn child, could barely keep pace. When one shoe caught on a root, the Indians jerked her forward without it, so that she limped awkwardly. Miriam, lost in her own misery, did not even notice her sister's plight. "I could have made it!" Her thoughts went round and round. "I had a chance! I might even have reached the fort but for that stupid Venus." Actually, she knew that even if she could have saved herself, she couldn't have helped the others. The men in the fort would not have dared to follow. Everyone knew that pursuit meant instant death for prisoners. She might have been safe herself, though, this very moment, inside those walls she had hated, which now seemed so precious a shelter. She had only her own soft-heartedness to thank that instead she was floundering through the brush at the mercy of these savages. Glancing up at their paint-streaked faces, Miriam could see no signs at all of any mercy. When the sun was directly overhead, they came to a halt. The children had made the 3 miles or so with less difficulty than the grown-ups. The 2 little girls, after several tumbles, had been slung across the redskins' shoulders like the sacks of goods. Sylvanus, with his sturdy little legs, had trudged alongside his captor, snuffling and wiping his tears against his jacket sleeve, but seemed none the worse for it. The Indians were fast losing patience with Susanna, who was quite plainly unable to go another step. They stood looking down at her sagging figure, with such disgust that for an instant Miriam forgot her own fear in a stab of terror for her sister's life. At a curt order from the leader, one of the Indians fumbled through a bag of the stolen supplies and produced a loaf of bread and a few apples and raisins. Divided among so many, it made scanty fare, but even these few mouthfuls Miriam found hard to swallow. "Better eat," advised Peter Labourie, who was nearest her. "I'm not hungry," said Miriam. "What are they going to do with us, Peter?" "If they're feeding us, that's a good sign. Means they don't mean to kill us. Not yet, anyway." The leader struck his tomahawk against a log meaningfully. "No talk," he ordered. "We go now. Walk fast. No talk any." As they struggled to their feet again, Miriam saw that the Indians' keen ears had caught a sound, and that they were watching intently the little clearing along the river, their hands ready on guns and tomahawks. Then she heard it too, a snapping of twigs and a heavy footstep. Hope leaped up and died away. It was only Scoggins, the ancient sway-back horse of Mr. Stevens, grazing innocently along the river. Poor old Scoggins, always good for a joke at the fort, all at once seemed almost beautiful. One of the Indians raised his rifle, but the leader spoke again, sharply. With a quick move he stepped forward and unfastened the thongs that bound James Johnson's arms. "Get horse," he answered, pointing at Scoggins. "Get horse for squaw." James, his arm free, gave one desperate look about the group, and Miriam knew what was in his mind. At once, however, James knew that his only hope lay in obeying the Indian's command, and he walked quietly toward the unsuspecting animal, holding in his hand the bit of apple that had been his share. Old Scoggins walked amiably into the trap, and in a moment had said goodbye to his peaceful river existence. Pilfered sacks and blankets were thrown over his back, and James hoisted his wife's limp weight into this improvised saddle. The afternoon march seemed endless. The Indians were still in a hurry, eager to get as far as possible from the fort before night fell. Toward sunset they came out on the shore of the river, and the prisoners understood that they were to cross. They were given a short chance to rest while the Indians dragged together dry branches to make a raft. Then Susanna was pushed onto the raft, James Johnson was ordered to swim alongside, and Peter Labourie was given poor Scoggins to force to the opposite shore. Miriam, sitting with the children, watched the frail platform that held her sister waver and sway, but it reached the other side, and presently returned for her and the little girls. When they were all across, the Indians kindled a fire, and hung over it the familiar copper kettles, in which Miriam and Susanna had stirred so many meals in the snug safety of their own cabin. These they filled with stolen porridge. As they waited for the porridge to boil, Miriam looked about at her captors. By some unspoken agreement, each of the prisoners seemed to belong to the Indian who had first laid hands upon him. The Indian who had found Miriam in the loft was never far from her side, even now that he seemed to think it safe to let go of her arm. There were not so many Indians, only 11 in all, though they had seemed such a savage horde inside the cabin. Taking advantage of this moment's pause, they were busily pawing over the goods they had plundered, now and then letting out cackles of delight as something struck their fancy. Miriam saw a candlestick, and 2 of Susanna's silver spoons, and then with a stab of real anguish, she caught a glimpse of blue flowered calico, the new dress. The Indian who was in the act of yanking the precious goods out of his sack looked up and caught her longing gaze, and a taunting grin broke over his dark features. "Why, he's young," Miriam realized with a shock. "Much younger than the others. And he's laughing at me. He knows it's my dress." Helpless fury surged hotly over her. "I hate him," she raged inwardly. "I could kill him for touching my dress with his dirty fingers." Following another guttural argument, the Indians decided to pitch camp in this place, very evidently blaming Susanna for slowing them up. After standing and looking at her for a long moment, the leader shrugged and left her alone. Whether from scorn or pity, it was hard to tell. Certainly she would not try to escape, but precautions had to be taken with the others. The Indians split branches and fashioned a crude sort of stocks over the legs of the men, tied by thongs that fastened high overhead on limbs of trees. The children fared better. Sue and little Polly had their ankles tied, but were given blankets. To her horror, Miriam was forced to lie down between 2 Indians, a heavy cord thrown over her body and held securely under theirs. All this was done in silence. The Indians spoke few words, and any attempt to speak on the part of the prisoners was met with fierce threats. Long after the Indians were asleep, Miriam lay rigid with mortification and fury between the 2 guards. They were so close that every breath she drew was filled with the heavy bear grease odor of their bodies. They had taken no pains to choose a smooth sleeping place. Twigs poked her back, and a sharp pebble bit into one shoulder. She could not roll over, and she dared not ease her aching muscles for fear the slightest tug on the cord would waken them. With the darkness, a new torment had commenced. The air was swarming with mosquitoes, whining and biting savagely. More than that, now that the shock of their captivity was wearing off, she had time to be afraid. Where were they going? What did the Indians have in store for them? All her life Miriam had heard tales of white men taken captive by Indians, some stories so horrible that the older settlers' voices would sink to whispers if a child were around. Those whispers, the fearful looks, the terrible words she had been able to catch, tortured her now. If she could only speak to Susanna, even to Labourie or James, they might be able to give her a little comfort. Sharper than hunger and fear, the memory of the blue dress pricked her, at the thought of its lovely folds, crumpled in that hateful boy's hands. The tears flooded her eyes, and turning her head against the ground, Miriam let them fall. There, in the wilderness, surrounded by savage enemies, bound for a fate she dared not imagine, she wept her heart out for a flowered dress she would never wear again. Chapter 1. Continued. Truly it had not been the work or the stifling summer inside the fort, or even the constant fear of Indians that had weighed on Miriam's spirit. It had been the loneliness. Of course she loved Susanna, just 10 years older than she. Supper, she thought ruefully. But I can wear the blue to meeting on Sunday, and perhaps, if I do all the work, Susanna will have another party before Phineas goes. Oh, how can I lie still all the hours till sunup? I can never sleep a wink. But she was sound asleep when the cabin shook with the tremendous knocking at the door. Chapter 2. The knocking startled Miriam wide awake. Pulling herself up to her knees, meant that Phineas had walked into the enclosure with the men. Something within her had unmistakably recognized him. He was different from the men she had known. He was strong and practical as any of them, as he proved by setting to work straight away, felling trees and dragging logs to repair the blockhouse. Inside of a half day, the settlement had accepted him as though he had been born at number 4. But there was a gentleness in his speech, and a purpose in his serious young face that set him slightly apart. It was incredible, even though he had said it in his own words, that he had noticed her in the brown homespun, even before he had seen her in the blue dress. In her own mind, the bolt of blue cloth that James had brought in his pack had changed her into a different person. The dress that hung close to her head, waiting for the first rays of sun to light it into beauty, symbolized the wonder of the past few days. I'll have to put on the old brown dress in the morning, probably even for some who had been both mother and sister, and she adored the children. But she longed for friends, for just one friend of her own. She had never known a girl her own age. She had never had a beau. Of the few young men and boys at the fort, now that she was too old for racing and climbing trees with them, she felt both shy and critical. She had had so little experience, she could not have put into words just what sort of person she waited for. Yet from the first moment